this might feel like a little bit of a bait and switch topic, based on the title of the video, but I don't know of any better way to put it. I want to talk about specific versus general mechanics, and not in the way that you might be thinking, not in the way that it is commonly used in a lot of games, not just RPGs, tabletop games in general. No, general versus specific is a mechanic that is often used in tabletop games to like layer rules so that it is clear when certain rules override other rules. You have your broad general rules, and then as you go down, you have more specific rules about more specific situations, and the rule of thumb, the general use of it is more specific rules override more general rules. Sure, that works for some games. That's not what I'm talking about. No, here I am talking about it's not a phenomenon. It is a sort of a design choice, or a way of approaching game design, which is either keep your rules real general so that they apply to a wide range of situations, or it is an option that represents a broader category of characters, versus more specific approach where you are pretty tightly defining what these rules are representing, and there isn't like a lot of wiggle room there. So you could kind of call it like more adaptable, less adaptable, if you like, but I think general and specific are the better terms for this. The chiefest example on my mind, of course, a while back I did a series of videos on how I would redesign the D&D classes. And when I did Bard, I got a lot of blowback about what I said there. Because what I said was, I would like to take the Bard from general all-purpose performance type class, which like is very non-specific, and I would make it specifically about music, whether it's singing or playing instruments or what have you. It's about music specifically, and by doing so, I could introduce new mechanics that would represent the flow of music as the Bard does what it does in combat. So you would have, a bunch of little sliders. You'd have your rhythm, your melody, and your volume. Were the three different like sliders, and they would move up and down in specific ways under specific circumstances, and each one would have different effects on the way that you are casting your spells. And I thought it was a really cool idea. Like, this is the kind of, if we were to rewrite the Bard in this way for a D&D type game, not 5th edition, but for a D&D type game, if there was a Bard that worked this way, that would probably be the number one class that would be most interesting to me, because I really like the way that it incorporates musical theory into gameplay. That's something I've never seen before. I've never seen any other game do it like that. So, I got a lot of blowback on that, saying that the Bard shouldn't be specifically about music. It needs to be about general performance, because you don't want to limit player fantasies. And I didn't accept that argument at the time, and I still don't. And I'll tell you why. Because if you have a player fantasy that is about some sort of performance or some sort of art other than music, there could be another class to cover it. There doesn't need to be one class that covers all art. There's no reason that has to be the case. And more recently, I got some vindication, because I've been introducing people to Fabula Ultima. And in that, there are several different performance-based classes. You have the Dancer, the Chanter, the Symbolist. These are all different art forms that are represented in the classes, and they're much more specific than the D&D Bard is. And as a result, their mechanics get to be a lot more strongly evocative of the fantasy that is intended there. The Dancer has this this mechanic where they want to do a different dance every round, and it's like cheaper to do a different dance, to like change which dance you're doing each round. The symbolist gets to like create these artworks. I imagine it as artwork. I guess you don't really have to. You could just call it like buffs and debuffs. But like, these like artworks, and they can have so many out at a time. The chanter, I literally do not remember at all what they do. I don't think I've read that class. So let me use that as an example, the class I know nothing about. The point being that because these are more specific classes and the fantasies are much more like narrowly defined, the mechanics get to be more strongly evocative of those fantasies. And what you end up with is a much more interesting character mechanically and maybe even narratively. The fact that it's in a system where you could reasonably expect to take all three of these in a single character, and it kind of works out, like that is a bonus. So like you don't actually have to choose. You can just take all the different art forms and slap them together. That's a thing you can do. So that was a moment of vindication when like multiple people were seeing that like, oh, actually this is really cool to do bardy kind of performance characters in this way, rather than having one class that's supposed to encompass all forms of art, all forms of performance, and kind of doesn't represent any of them mechanically. So that was an experience where like, I'm pretty sure my previous statement was right. That having classes with like a specific intended fantasy that you are able to express well in the mechanics is, I think, generally preferable to having a broad fantasy that doesn't really commit in any direction. Non-committal design is like, it's not universally disastrous, but I think it's a lot harder to make it work well. Like you're putting a lot more assuming you want all of your options to be sort of equally evocative and equally interesting, I think you're putting yourself at a big disadvantage, a massive handicap, by having some classes be very broad and very like vaguely defined. Like what does a fighter do in D&D? It fights. I mean, sure, like that is a thing that it does. That is a thing that is represented mechanically, but like, is that very interesting? Like, it's not very evocative, is it? And it's very broad if you think about it, because like there's lots of different ways to fight. There's fighting unarmed, there's fighting with ranged weapons, there's fighting with melee weapons, big two-handed weapons, two-weapon fighting. You've got, sort of like the dodgy aspects. Like, what aspects of fighting? Like, martial combat is a very interesting and complicated beast. Lots of different facets that you could focus on, but the fighter doesn't focus on any. It's just a fighter, and it has to be general. I also got some blowback on my video about redesigning the fighter because I said that I would make it primarily melee. Like a little bit of ranged support, but mainly it's a melee class. And people don't like that. They say, no, the fighter needs to be good at all weapons. Why? That is a much broader, more general kind of fantasy, and it's difficult to support all different forms of combat equally and in a way that is interesting for each one. It's just a lot more difficult, and needlessly difficult, I would say, because it's different fantasies. The archer is a different fantasy than the big two-handed axe wielder. Those are different character archetypes in most like settings and stories. So I'm more and more coming to the conclusion that narrowly defined, specific, focused type character options are usually the way to go. Which is not to say that I am against reflavoring, because obviously, I'm kind of a fan of 4th edition. 4th edition has a lot of reflavor potential in a lot of its stuff. But I think that on the one hand, yes, you need to keep your mechanics broad in order to facilitate reflavoring. But on the other hand, like that, it's kind of a different approach, isn't it? This 4th edition is what was it? It's a bottom up kind of design where like we're gonna establish the game mechanics and make sure those are solid, and then decide what flavor applies to each one. Kind of. I'm sure that there are definitely classes that they designed where they started with the concept and then decided how to make it mechanically. But the priority is on making the mechanics work well so that you can reflavor, which means that even in narrowly defined classes, and even in Fabula Ultima, where you have these narrowly defined classes, they can all be reflavored. And it is strongly encouraged, it is directly and explicitly encouraged in the book to reflavor these classes in specific ways. So I'm not against reflavoring. Keep your game mechanics broad enough to have some wiggle room, but having well-defined flavor for each character option allows you greater freedom for expressing those fantasies mechanically. And I think that is just a really good idea. And I like to see that in my games, pretty much like universally. I'm never sorry to see some game element that says like, this is very evocative of the setting or the character or whatever for this game. And like you can feel it in the mechanics. Like sometimes you just look at like like a talent or a piece of equipment or a class or whatever it is in your game, and you say, that is super cool. That mechanic tells a story about this character and about the world that they inhabit. Sometimes you do that, and those are peak moments. Like that's how you get me interested in an RPG. So, in the debate of specific versus general, in terms of like how broad of a fantasy you're representing, I'm always going to lean towards specific for these reasons.